Gun battles and mass protests have engulfed parts of Amhara, Ethiopia's second biggest region. That's after a move to centralise the regional security forces of the country's 11 states. Protesters believe the government's decision would leave them vulnerable to attacks by neighbouring regions. For more on this, we are joined by lawyer and researcher Mastewal Taddese Terefe. Thank you very much, Mastewal, for your time this afternoon. What do we need to understand about what is going on in Amhara? Reports coming in suggest that there is some sort of repression with opposition parties being arrested, top officials also being arrested.
Thank you for having me. To put this in context, I think the best way to understand what's happening in Amhara region right now is to look at the peace agreement or cessation of hostilities agreement that was signed in South Africa actually months ago. So the federal government making peace with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. As you recall, as your audience recalls, there was a devastating civil war in the Tigray region that also involved Amhara special forces and Amhara and territorial claims that they have on their border with Tigray. So at the end of the peace deal, which did not include the Amhara, there was an agreement that the land that's disputed by the Amharas and the Tigrayans the dispute will be resolved according to the constitution, and that issue was kind of postponed for later. Now the Amhara and the protesters believe that the current move by the government in Ethiopia to disband the special forces in Amhara is a preparation for either a return of those lands that the Amhara took over at the beginning of the war to the Tigrayans, or they see it also as just another way to weaken the regional force, which perceives a threat by obviously the TPLF and the Tigrayan Defense Forces, as well as other special forces in the country. Oromo is another big region that the Amhara always point to as a potential threat. There's a lot of ethnic polarization that has put all these different ethnic groups sort of on the fence. So the main concern really is that if the regional force in Amhara is disbanded, the Amhara see themselves as being cornered and potentially at risk of attacks by all sorts of forces in the country.
And do you know how the government has responded to this?
Well, the government has issued these statements. The last one from the Prime Minister basically framing this move and policy as a neutral policy that will integrate all special forces that different regional states in Ethiopia have, and not just aimed at the Amhara. And there's also some announcement from another regional state, the Somali regional state, that the special force there in that region will be disbanded. However, so it's being framed as a neutral policy, and there's also a statement from the government that this will be implemented at all costs, even if the consequence will be an escalation of the conflict there, or an escalation into a violent conflict there. So the message is that this will be implemented regardless, and that this is a law enforcement operation, a term that the Prime Minister has used when the war in Tigray started. So the same language is being used, and that this will be implemented regardless of protests in the region.
There are some reports, especially if you take a look at some organizations online, that there's been mass killings. It's been quite brutal, and some are characterizing it even as a genocide that is happening in Amhara. Is this something you're aware of and can verify for us?
Yeah, it is. I think that the use of these terms, which are really quite shocking, and they may appear as just provocative, right? The term of genocide and massacres. But what's happening in Ethiopia in the past 3 years is troubling, and most of these conflicts and the violent attacks are along ethnic lines. So it's understandable that, for example, in Amhara region, the long record of targeting of Amhara minorities in different parts of Ethiopia, and the continuation of that trend, despite the end of the war in Tigray, that all puts the people at risk. And so the threat of genocidal attacks and massacres is real, and it's actually being we are witnessing it on a daily basis. However, I think that there is, again, the opposition groups are again kind of looking at it as an isolated incident, whereas we should look at what's going on in Amhara and also what transpired in Tigray as a general problem that Ethiopia has to confront, with looking at the constitution that is really the major grievance for the Amhara, the idea that the federal structure being along ethnic or linguistic lines has created the environment where ethnic attacks have become the norm. So we have to address that very, elephant in the room, essentially, but in a way that's consultative and inclusive of all forces, all stakeholders in Ethiopia. However, now, because the division is so strong, you will see just, different groups really shouting for their own or who they deem to be their own at different times, and the government taking turns to corner different opposition groups at convenient times, unfortunately.
This is the home of the African Union. Are they saying anything? What's going on?
I mean, this is it's unfortunate. I mean, with the Pretoria deal, there was a lot of optimism, and I think it was some progress in, seeing African stakeholders, obviously South African delegates, but also President Kenyatta taking an active role in negotiating what happened, the result in Pretoria, and also the implementing procedures in Nairobi. However, as an institution, the AU has not been very proactive. Even at the beginning of the war, there was almost a blanket endorsement, this is in 2020, of the war in Tigray, which, unfortunately has claimed more than 500,000 lives. This is a low estimate, the casualties in the war. So the AU has, because I think of its location in Addis and the diplomatic power that Ethiopia has in basically moderating the AU's voice on Ethiopian issues, it hasn't been as active as it can be in pushing the relevant parties to come to a negotiating table before another cycle of war starts. And what I think, diplomats and African Union stakeholders are doing right now is taking note of what's happening in Amhara as a continuation of the war, and really take measured steps to prevent it from escalating into another violent confrontation, pushing the Abiy administration to bring these dissenting voices in Amhara to a negotiating table, and make sure that their concerns are going to be addressed in a peaceful platform alongside their brothers and sisters from Tigray. Instead, what's happening right now is they're simply peacemaking with the TPLF, which is good, but that is obviously cornering the arch enemy, now the Amharas, into a corner, and another cycle of propaganda is being created that this is just a law enforcement operation that is there to enforce the constitution, the same narrative that was used to justify the war in Tigray.
Sure. Thank you very much for helping us make sense of all of that. Mastewal Taddese Terefe, she's a lawyer and researcher.